Before we start exciting stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and share it with your friends. Also, please, can you tell me where and what time you are watching? No exit from Ashen Hill? The road to Ashen Hill was barely marked, a single dirt path cutting through dense woods that stretched endlessly in every direction. Few people traveled it, and even fewer returned to tell the tale. The locals whispered of strange occurrences, of travelers who lost their way, their voices fading into the shadows of the forest. But for Claire, the warnings were nothing more than superstition. She was a journalist for Urban Mysteries, a blog dedicated to unraveling myths and legends. When she first heard of Ashen Hill, a place where time allegedly stopped, where no one could escape, she dismissed it as nonsense. But the intrigue of a story untouched by the mainstream was too tempting to ignore. The day Claire set out, the sky was a heavy gray, the kind of overcast that made the air feel suffocating. Armed with her camera, a voice recorder, and a map she downloaded from the internet, she drove her battered hatchback into the wilderness. The GPS signal disappeared within the first 20 minutes, leaving her to rely on the crumpled map spread across the passenger seat. The road narrowed as she climbed, the trees leaning like silent spectators, their skeletal branches clawed at the sky, and the deeper she went, the more the air seemed to thicken. An unsettling quiet enveloped her, broken only by the crunch of gravel under her tires. Then the car sputtered and died. No, 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 Claire muttered, twisting the key in the ignition. The engine groaned but refused to turn over. With a frustrated sigh, she stepped out, grabbing her backpack and slinging it over her shoulder. The map indicated the town of Ashen Hill was less than a mile away. She decided to walk the rest of the way, figuring she'd find help once she arrived. The path wound upward, the trees growing denser until they blocked out what little sunlight remained. As she climbed, the air grew colder, carrying with it a faint, acrid smell. It was subtle at first, but the further she went, the stronger it became, a mix of burned wood and rotting leaves. When Claire finally reached the top, the forest opened to reveal a small village shrouded in an eerie mist. The buildings were old, their wooden frames blackened as though charred by fire. Despite the dilapidation, the streets were eerie clean, devoid of debris or signs of life. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally as she walked down the main road. "Hello?" she called out. Her voice seemed to bounce back at her, amplified by the emptiness. "Is anyone here?" No response. She stopped in front of what appeared to be a general store. Its windows were intact but coated in grime, making it impossible to see inside. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open. Inside, the shelves were stocked with goods that looked untouched, but everything was covered in a fine layer of ash. Her skin prickled as she realized the air inside was even colder than outside. A sudden movement in the corner of her vision made her spin around. A figure stood in the shadows, barely visible, its outline distorted by the dim light. "Hello?" she repeated, her voice shaking. The figure didn't move. It was tall and humanoid, but something about it was off. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnatural. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, dissolving into the shadows. Claire's heart raced. She stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a display of canned goods. Desperate for answers, she left the store and walked further into the village. Every building was the same, intact but lifeless, as though the town had been frozen in time. She reached what appeared to be the town square. A crumbling fountain stood in the center, its once pristine marble now streaked with black. In the stillness she heard it, a low hum, barely audible, emanating from somewhere nearby. Drawn to the sound, Claire followed it to a large stone building at the edge of the square. It looked like a church, its steeple leaning precariously to one side. The double doors were slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The interior was vast and empty, the pews arranged in neat rows that seemed untouched by time. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the air. At the far end of the room, where the altar should have been, stood a mirror. It was enormous, nearly reaching the ceiling, its frame intricately carved with twisting, grotesque figures. The surface of the mirror wasn't reflective but dark, as though filled with liquid shadows. Claire approached it slowly, her reflection barely visible in the murky surface. The hum grew louder, resonating in her chest. She reached out, her fingers inches from the glass, when the surface rippled like water. Claire. She froze. The voice came from the mirror, soft and melodic, yet distinctly hers. Her reflection began to shift, its movements no longer mirroring her own. It smiled, a slow, unnatural curve of the lips that sent chills down her spine. "What are you?" Claire whispered. The reflection's smile widened. "Trap." Before she could react, the mirror surface burst outward, tendrils of shadow wrapping around her wrists and ankles. She screamed, struggling against their grip, but they were too strong. The world around her twisted, the church dissolving into darkness. When the shadows receded, she was back in the village square, but something was different. The buildings were no longer blackened but pristine, their windows glowing with warm light. People filled the streets, laughing and talking, their faces unfamiliar yet strangely familiar. They moved with a mechanical precision, their smiles never wavering. "Welcome," a voice said behind her. She turned to see an older man, his face kind, but his eyes empty. "You're one of us now," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "There's no exit from Ashen Hill." Claire tried to protest, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. Her legs carried her into the crowd, her face stretching into a smile that didn't feel like her own. The last shred of her identity dissolved as she became one with the village. The next day the dirt road to Ashen Hill was gone, swallowed by the forest, and the village waited, shrouded in mist, for its next visitor. The Black Veil. The town of Greystone was unremarkable in many ways. Nestled in a valley, surrounded by dense forests and steep hills, it was a quiet place where the most exciting news usually involved livestock wandering onto someone's property. Yet, among the locals there was one story they never told aloud, a story whispered only in hushed tones behind closed doors. It was the story of the Black Veil. The tale began with the abandoned chapel on the outskirts of town. Once a place of worship, it had fallen into ruin after a devastating fire nearly a century ago. The villagers claimed that the fire was no accident, that it had been summoned by something unholy. They said that anyone who ventured into the chapel at night would not return the same, if they returned at all. Emma hadn't grown up in Greystone. She moved there after inheriting her late aunt's home, seeking solace and a fresh start after a painful divorce. The small town life appealed to her, the simplicity, the distance from her chaotic past. But it also bored her. Greystone's quiet charm soon gave way to restlessness. She wanted adventure, a spark, something to break the monotony. That's why when she overheard the story of the Black Veil at the local diner, her curiosity piqued. "What's the Black Veil?" she had asked innocently, interrupting the conversation between two elderly men at the next table. They froze, their faces paling. "It's nothing," one of them said sharply, his tone leaving no room for further questions. But Emma couldn't let it go. The more she asked around, the more she noticed the same reaction: fear, avoidance, and terse refusals to elaborate. Finally, a younger woman named Sarah, who worked at the diner, took pity on her curiosity. "It's an old story," Sarah explained in a low voice, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "They say the Black Veil is a spirit, or maybe a curse. It lives in the old chapel. If you see it, it's too late. People who've encountered it either disappear or change. They come back, but they're not themselves anymore." "What do you mean, not themselves?" Emma asked. Sarah hesitated. "They stop talking, they stop eating. It's like their soul's been ripped out. Most don't last more than a few weeks." The story lingered in Emma's mind, a dark allure she couldn't shake. That night, as she sat in her modest living room with a glass of wine, she decided to see the chapel for herself. She told herself it was just an old building, a relic of a bygone era. Ghost stories didn't scare her. She was a woman of reason. The next evening, armed with a flashlight and a sturdy pair of boots, Emma made her way to the chapel. The forest surrounding it was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of nocturnal animals strangely absent. The path was overgrown, the underbrush clawing at her legs as if trying to hold her back. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, casting everything in shades of shadow. When she reached the chapel, its looming silhouette took her breath away. The building was skeletal, its roof caved in, its walls blackened by fire. Vines crept up the stone facade, and the air around it felt unnaturally cold. For a moment she considered turning back, but then she saw it, the faintest flicker of light through the shattered stained glass window. "Hello?" she called out, her voice swallowed by the silence. There was no response, but the light persisted, beckoning her forward. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and mildew. Her flashlight swept across the room, revealing rows of charred pews and the remnants of an altar. The light she had seen outside seemed to emanate from the far corner where a staircase led down into the earth. Emma hesitated at the top of the stairs. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to forget this place and its cursed stories. But her curiosity was stronger. She descended the steps, her flashlight cutting through the inky blackness. The basement was colder than the chapel above, the air damp and heavy. The light led her to a small alcove where she found a veil draped over a rusted iron stand. It was black as night, shimmering faintly as if alive. She reached out, her fingers hovering inches from the fabric, when a voice spoke behind her. "Don't." She spun around, her flashlight revealing a gaunt man with hollow eyes. His face was lined with age, but his expression was one of pure terror. "Who are you?" Emma demanded, her voice trembling. "Leave," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You've seen it. That's enough." "Seen what?" "The veil," he said, glancing nervously at the alcove. "It's not for you. It's not for anyone." "What happens if I touch it?" The man's eyes widened. "It takes you. It shows you things you're not meant to see. Please leave now." Emma's heart pounded. Part of her wanted to listen, to run back up the stairs and never look back. But another part of her, the part that refused to be told what to do, took over. She turned back to the veil and, before she could second guess herself, touched it. The world around her dissolved. She was no longer in the chapel, but in a void of swirling darkness. Shapes moved in the periphery of her vision, grotesque and ever-changing. Whispers filled the air, a cacophony of voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Her body felt weightless, as if she were floating, yet she couldn't move. A figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in the same black as the veil. Its face was obscured, but its eyes burned like embers. "You sought the truth," it said, its voice resonating in her mind. "Now you will bear its weight." Images flooded her vision: wars, famines, the collapse of civilizations. She saw faces twisted in agony, heard screams that seemed to tear through her very soul. Then came the personal visions, her own failures, her darkest moments laid bare before her. The pain was unbearable, as if the veil was stripping away every layer of her being, leaving her raw and exposed. When it ended, she was back in the chapel, collapsed on the cold stone floor. The gaunt man was gone. The veil lay crumpled in the alcove, its faint shimmer extinguished. Emma stumbled out of the chapel, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She barely remembered the walk home, her legs moving on autopilot. When she finally reached her house, she locked the door and collapsed onto the couch, trembling. The visions haunted her. Days turned into weeks, but the images wouldn't fade. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating, consumed by the weight of what she had seen. She tried to tell the townsfolk, but they wouldn't listen. They avoided her now, whispering behind her back. One night, as she sat alone in her darkened living room, she saw it again, the faint flicker of light, this time in her own reflection. The veil was calling her back, and deep down she knew she could never escape it. Emma disappeared that night. The townsfolk found her house empty, her belongings untouched. They whispered that she had been taken by the Black Veil like so many before her. The chapel remains a dark stain on the edge of grey stone, and the veil waits, shimmering faintly, for the next curious soul to come seeking its terrible truth. The Tunnel of Endless Night. The train rattled down the tracks, its rhythmic clanking echoing in the dimly lit carriage. Eleanor clutched her journal tightly, her knuckles pale against the worn leather cover. The journey was supposed to be routine, a quick overnight trip to the next town for a family visit. Yet something felt wrong. The station had been nearly deserted, and the ticket clerk had stared at her with an unsettling intensity before handing over her ticket. She had brushed it off a long day for both of them, she had assumed, but now she wasn't so sure. Outside the window, the world was shrouded in an impenetrable darkness, broken only by the fleeting glow of passing station signs. As the train sped forward, the lights in the carriage flickered. Eleanor's chest tightened. Just old wiring, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the train's roar. She looked around the carriage. There were only three other passengers, a businessman engrossed in his laptop, a teenage boy scrolling through his phone, and an elderly woman knitting with methodical precision. None of them seemed bothered by the flickering lights. The train began to slow, the brakes screeching like a wounded animal. Eleanor glanced at her watch. 1:47 a.m. There wasn't supposed to be a stop here. She peered out the window but saw nothing but endless black. The train halted with a final jarring lurch. The intercom crackled to life. "Attention passengers, we are making an unscheduled stop due to technical difficulties. Please remain seated. We will resume shortly." The voice was monotone, devoid of any emotion. Eleanor's unease deepened. The businessman groaned, snapping his laptop shut. The teenager muttered something under his breath. Only the elderly woman seemed unaffected, her knitting needles clinking softly in the silence. Minutes stretched into hours. The air in the carriage grew heavy, oppressive. Eleanor's unease turned to fear as she noticed something odd. The windows were no longer reflecting the interior of the train. Instead, they showed only the blackness outside, as though the light inside had been swallowed whole. She turned to the businessman. "Excuse me, do you know what's going on?" He looked at her, his face pale. "It's just a delay," he said, though his voice trembled. "These things happen." The teenager snorted. "Yeah, sure, because random stops in the middle of nowhere are totally normal." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Do you think we should check with the conductor?" The businessman shook his head. "We're safer here." Safer. The word lingered, heavy with implication. Safer from what? As if on cue, the train jolted violently, throwing Eleanor against the seat in front of her. The lights flickered and then died, plunging the carriage into complete darkness. Someone screamed. Eleanor's breathing quickened as she fumbled for her phone, its flashlight casting a narrow beam of light. "Is everyone okay?" she called out. The teenager cursed. "What the hell was that?" The businessman's voice was strained. "I don't know. Just stay calm." The elderly woman said nothing. Eleanor swung her flashlight toward her seat and froze. The woman was gone, her knitting abandoned on the seat. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. Where did she go? The teenager stood, his phone flashlight scanning the carriage. She was right there. She can't just vanish. The train lurched again, and Eleanor's flashlight flickered. For a brief moment she saw something in the beam of light. A figure, hunched and shadowy, standing at the far end of the carriage. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. "Did you see that?" Eleanor whispered, her voice shaking. "See what?" the businessman asked, panic creeping into his tone. "There was someone, something at the end of the carriage." The teenager's light swung toward the spot, but it revealed nothing. "You're imagining things." Eleanor wasn't so sure. The air felt colder now, and the oppressive darkness seemed to press closer. She clutched her journal like a talisman, its familiar weight grounding her. The intercom crackled again. "Passengers are advised to disembark immediately." The voice was different this time, distorted, malevolent. "No," the businessman muttered. "No way. We're not getting off this train." "Do we even have a choice?" the teenager asked, his voice laced with fear. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the carriage door. It slid open with a hiss, revealing a yawning black tunnel beyond. A faint sound drifted in a low, mournful wail that made her blood run cold. I'm not going out there, the businessman declared. The teenager hesitated, his phone light trembling in his grip. What if staying here is worse? Eleanor's instinct screamed at her to stay put, but curiosity gnawed at her. I think we have to go, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The three of them stepped cautiously into the tunnel. The train's lights flickered one last time before the carriage was swallowed by darkness, leaving them alone in the suffocating black. The tunnel seemed endless, its walls slick and pulsating, as if alive. The sound of their footsteps echoed unnaturally, each step amplifying the growing sense of dread. The teenager tried to lighten the mood. Maybe this is just some crazy prank, he said, though his laugh was hollow. Prank or not, we need to keep moving, Eleanor replied. She glanced back, but the train was gone as if it had never been there. The wailing grew louder and the walls of the tunnel seemed to close in. Eleanor's flashlight caught movement ahead, a figure stumbling toward them. Help me, the figure rasped, collapsing at their feet. It was the elderly woman, her face twisted in terror. Her hands clawed at Eleanor's arm. It's coming. What's coming? Eleanor asked, kneeling beside her. The woman's eyes widened, her pupils dilating. The darkness. It's hungry. She convulsed violently, then went still. The businessman stumbled back. We're going to die here. Pull yourself together. Eleanor snapped, though her own voice wavered. She looked down the tunnel where the darkness seemed to thicken, swallowing their light. We have to keep moving. They pressed on, their fear palpable. The wailing turned into whispers, voices murmuring in languages Eleanor couldn't understand. Shadows danced just beyond the reach of their light, flickering and taunting. What is this place? The teenager whispered. Eleanor shook her head. I don't know, but it's not natural. Ahead, a faint light glimmered. Hope surged through Eleanor. There, keep going. The light grew brighter as they approached, revealing a door set into the tunnel wall. It was ornate, carved with strange symbols that seemed to writhe and shift. Eleanor reached for the handle, hesitating as a voice echoed in her mind. Turn back. Do you hear that? She asked, looking at the others. The businessman nodded, his face pale. It's in my head. We don't have a choice, Eleanor said, steeling herself. She opened the door. Beyond was a vast chamber, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected nothing but darkness. In the center stood a figure cloaked in shadow, its form shifting and indistinct. Welcome, it said, its voice a chorus of whispers. You have come far. Eleanor's heart pounded. What do you want? To feed, the figure replied. And you have brought sustenance. The shadows lunged. Eleanor screamed as the darkness enveloped them, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. She felt herself falling, the void consuming her. When she opened her eyes, she was back on the train. The lights were steady, the carriage filled with passengers. She blinked, disoriented. The businessman and the teenager were gone, their seats empty. Her journal lay on her lap, open to a page she hadn't written. In jagged letters it read, The tunnel of endless night never lets go. Eleanor looked out the window and her blood ran cold. The world outside was still dark, and the train was unmoving. It never had.